Hey everyone, and welcome to Almost Cancelled. I am Peter, and today I am here to talk about When They See Us Part 1. Usually I say Season 1, Episode 1, but this is a mini-series, just parts 1 through 4. This is actually a Patreon-funded and requested review. So thank you to Zammer Jammer for for selecting this. But so this is a 4-part mini-series based on the true story of the Central Park 5, which it's not a story that I was overly familiar with beyond just the very broadest of strokes. Just the basic idea of the five young men who were accused of this and went to prison, served time, and were later exonerated at some point down the line. That's basically the extent of my knowledge going into this. It's not something I really knew about. It's worth mentioning that when this happened in the spring of 1989, I was about minus 1 month old. So definitely sort of a little bit early for my recollection. Although I do wonder actually if anyone, like if the UK at all was even talking about this when it happened. It's one of those things, especially in the pre-internet age. I'm not sure if it would have translated to the media all that much beyond a passing mention. But yeah, so this is written and directed by Ava DuVernay, and it's kind of an in-depth look at the story of these characters, these people, these falsely accused young black men who were coerced into confessions. That's the word I'm looking for. I forgot the word confession. This is off to a great start, but they're forced into giving confessions, which I don't suspect will last very long. That said, I've only watched this first episode so far, so I'll find out the details of what comes next. This first episode, and I guess I'll just give the spoiler warning in general, full spoilers. Even though it's in episode 1, it is based on a true story. I feel like dancing around details here would be kind of silly. So the first episode of this is basically the arrest itself, and then the interviews, the interrogations that take place within the first couple of days leading up to the actual arrest themselves. And very much this episode obviously is here to highlight a couple of different things. It's here to highlight how these young men are treated. And I say young men, I mean, we're talking about teenagers here. We're talking about, legally children. How they're treated, how the way the police department go around in trying to quote unquote solve the case, and I really do have to throw up the air quotes when I say that, because basically they've decided who the culprits are very quickly, and they're just trying to make it stick. They're trying to prove something that they've decided is already true, and they essentially try to do it through nothing but the interviews, through the interrogations, by scaring these kids into confessing. One of the very notable parts of this first episode and the true story, I guess, is that none of the young boys have lawyers with them, pretty much at all. And for the most part, barring maybe very late on in the process, do they even have guardians or parents with them? Most of them are going through these interviews with no one there. And the tactics that we see, because this is the thing, like, very early on in this episode, quite quickly after they're picked up, Felicity Hoffman, who plays kind of the person in charge of the case, who sort of is calling the shots. There's a bit of a dispute between her and someone from Homicide, I think it is, but she ultimately wins the case, and she wants to go after, and she very quickly says, like, all these people who were in the park, they're not just potential witnesses, they're suspects, because there's a lot of activity in the park. I mean, the first part of the episode is, all these kids sort of basically just being teenagers and hanging around the park. There are a couple of older kids who are assaulting bicyclists and other things, so there's some other incidents going on in the park, but the deduction is made very quickly by the police that, well, these kids are suspects, and we're going to somehow try and prove that this is something they did. So obviously the corruption and the discrimination here is off the charts once things really get going. But what was notable, because I wasn't sure how in my face it was going to be. I wasn't sure if it was going to like sort of like always kind of operate under this guise of ambiguity with the police officers and how they're tackling this. Like, would there technically be something to justify a lot of the choices they make? And there isn't. No, it full on goes. They're clearly trying to coerce confession so they can get a conviction, so they can tick it off the checklist and have an answer that people will accept. It's a very tough watch, but I think what stood out to me though is that up until the moment hits where the interrogations start, because when the interrogations start and it starts cutting between the interrogations, that's where you really get the awful sense of how they're manipulating all of these people to talk against each other, and it makes for one of the most, because the ending of this episode is perfect. I mean, if it's, I think the episode's really well done. I mean, that's if that wasn't clear already, but the last 5 minutes, there's a basically a period at the end of the episode where the characters finally get to meet the at least 4 of the 5 get to actually meet each other in a room and have something of a conversation. And it's worth mentioning these 5 kids don't actually all know each other. Some of them know each other, but not all of them know each other. To the point where they're in the confessions portion of the episode, and they're been asked to like sort of accuse X and Y, and who did this to the woman and who did that to the woman. They're having to like ask the officers to remind them what the names are and like get the names right. They clearly have no idea who they're talking about in any of this. And it's this wonderful moment at the end of the episode where those 4 of them get into a room, and they kind of like introduce each other, and they say their names, and they realize that once one says their name, because I should say the 5 people here actually. This is really important. So you got Kevin Richardson, you got Antron McRae, Yusuf Salim, Corey Wise, and Raymond Santana Jr. These are the 5 people in question that we're talking about. So once they start saying their names at the end, though, when they're in this sort of holding cell together, waiting to be essentially carted off in front of the press and put in the police cars, there's a moment where I don't remember who speaks first and who sort of says their name first. I think it might be Tron says his name, and it's Kevin who says as an Antron, because that's what the police have been calling him, so that's what he knows him as. And he realizes that he has said really awful things about. There's a really quiet moment before because I wasn't necessarily sure that if he was going to admit it to him and say out loud what he'd done. But there's a quiet moment where you can see that the awful horror in his face is like this is this innocent person that he has been forced to accuse of doing some very horrible things, because that's what the police said. Oh, if you just do this, we'll let you go. It'll be all fine. And of course it isn't. And you know that, watching this, if you have any idea of what this story is, the one detail you probably know is that they all go to prison for this. So none of them, they're being promised all these things. If you just, point fingers at these other people, like, and of course, so there's the heart-sinking moment later in the episode when Felicity Huffman just casually says, "No, they're all guilty. All 5 of these people, they're all guilty. They're all going." Anyway, the point I was trying to get to earlier that I kept dancing off of was the language which is used before we even get to the obscene corruption of the interrogations themselves. Felicity Huffman in particular keeps spouting lines. She keeps referring to them as thugs, as animals. She keeps referring to these kids as she's already found them guilty in her head. And call me crazy, but police work in proving someone's guilt and building a case against them should be a lot like a science, right? You have a theory, but you have to rule everything out. You have to rule people out. You have to rule options out. And even though the evidence repeatedly in this, there's probably one of the most frustrating scenes in the episode actually, is a scene with her. William Sadler's in here. He's playing one of the police officers. There's a bunch of cast in here. I mentioned Felicity Huffman. Vera Farmiga's in here. Kelly Bunbury from Pitch is in here. She plays the older sister of one of the teens. They're in this room. Not all those characters, but all the police officers are in the room. And they're basically trying to build a timeline with the map of Central Park and like where they know certain characters were at certain times, where they know things happened. And they're basically trying to make the square-shaped peg fit into the circular like hole. They're trying to, because the other cop in the room is aggressively sort of pointing out the plot holes, as it were, the logical inconsistencies, and how it's impossible for one person to get from there to there in this time. The time we have of the victim, of the woman, the jogger, being dragged off the path, doesn't match up with where these other kids were at this time, but we're determined to prove that it was them somehow. And the most heartbreaking thing about the scene, aside from the absurd the way they're doing this, is that there's a black police officer in the room, but he's a uniform. He's not like a detective with them. He's there to help or whatever. I mean, whatever his role is in this particular scene, but he's just standing there quietly in uniform because he's not in charge of the case. He's lower ranked, and he's just witnessing this. And his eyes tell such a story as he's watching how they're trying to make this all fit. He even knows one of the teenagers. That's kind of a point earlier on, because he tries to tell the police officers not to go in and interrogate. I think it was Kevin in particular. He says, his mother left because she felt sick, and the police officer William Sadler, his eyes light up because wait, she left by choice. That's open season. It's Christmas, and he goes in because now they know they can go in there and essentially coerce whatever they want out of him. They intimidate him, and I think all the characters, like, it's quite heartbreaking watching them all kind of break down because they don't even know why they're there when they're first taken in, and when when the word rape is first mentioned and when the crime is brought up, what they're being asked about, they all react quite emotionally. They all have this look of fear, and they're broken down to the point where they're told to say things about the other characters who they don't even know. Their details of the story don't match up at all because of course it doesn't. They're at the point, and it's very frustrating because it all comes from different places where Raymond is kind of convinced maybe earliest to kind of lie about the others for his own good, and his father, who another actor actually, oh god, oh his name's escaping me, Luigi. John Leguizamo. I'm probably butchering that pronunciation, but Luigi, right? That's his father, and he had to go to work, and he had to leave his mother, who doesn't speak English, with his son at the police station, and he ends up agreeing to all this. He's got a statement, and by the time his father gets there, he doesn't even know that his son's involved in a rape case. He doesn't even know what the parameters of the crime are or why he's there. He sits down at the interrogation table and sees this statement talking about what he witnessed, and he's in shock. So you have that, and then that contrasts with the again another actor that pops in here that I know from other things, Michael K. Williams. He's Antron's father, and he basically has to plead with his son because the detective at one point threatens him and says, "Hey, does your boss know about your past? That you did time?" And he kind of threatens the father, and he goes in and has to basically tell his son, "Now tell them whatever like they want to hear." So this goes away, and we get to go home. This is, clearly, I think when we talk about the systemic racism that's kind of at play here, the idea that his father has already broken down to the point where he wants his son to lie and go along with what they're saying because it's the path of at least hopeful, at least resistance. It's the path that maybe leads to the happier ending, which it doesn't. It doesn't in this case, but it's the only option he sees actually bearing any kind of fruit, as it were. And because he even says that they'll arrest us, they'll kill us. It's something that his son clearly doesn't quite understand yet, and it's the shock of all these parents and older siblings when they find out what their kids or their siblings have been accused of. It's this shocking gut punch of this doesn't make sense, and we see why they're all in the park. We see that they're not all there together. We see all these things in the episode. We see even the policeman bash the helmet off of Kevin's face, and then as later that is used as this is where he was scratched by the victim whilst there was struggling happening, and it's kind of like it's appalling stuff. In fact, that's one of the things that comes back up at the end when they're all in the room together and they're kind of slowly sort of admitting that they've said awful things about each other, and they never realize because once two of them realize the names, then Yusuf says up, Raymond says his name, and they all realize that they've all said awful things about each other. And I think what's kind of wonderful about this scene is that there's no like anger, like they're very apologetic to each other, but there's no anger. They kind of just, or they all understand what they've all went through. They all understand what they've just been forced through, what their last 24 hours has been like, and it's this heartbreaking kind of moment where they all have to just accept what they've all done and realize they've all been played against each other. That was the police tactic the entire time, was to play these kids against each other, which it feels especially malicious when none of them, or at least most of them, didn't even know who each other were. It was all very kind of a blanket and vague, to the point where when the police are telling them to write down their statements, they're actively changing details. They're getting them to give statements on camera, and they're changing the details of what they're saying so that everything matches a little bit better. And that's when Corey Wise, the fifth one, kind of comes into it, because he didn't even get taken to the police station by force. He was kind of, I mean, to say he did it voluntarily is maybe a bit of a stretch, because there is kind of an implication that he should go with the police officer in the street, but he goes kind of out of support of Yusuf. He's Yusuf's friend, and he goes with him, and he's kind of left there because Yusuf's the only one, at least who seems to get taken home briefly by his mother, because his mother, when eventually she finds out where he is and what he's been kept for, she gives Felicity Hoffman hell. She's like, you left him in there without a guardian, without a lawyer. He's only 15. He can't waive his rights to a lawyer. He's not old enough. And their argument is that he has a it was a library card that said his age was 16, which he said that he forged a little bit to impress a girl. That's not his real age, which doesn't seem like something that should be much of a problem in proving, right? When his mum says to her, he's only 15, her comeback, Felicity Huffman says, well, he's got ID on him that says that he's 16, and she's like, show me the birth certificate. And I'm like, yeah, she probably will, but obviously she doesn't have it on her right now. It's like, this is proving what age someone is a fairly, solid piece of information that you can't bend. You can't bend one way or the other. Of course, I'm assuming here that the problem is that once they've got all these confessions, once they've got all this on camera, they've got all these statements, it doesn't necessarily matter what it should matter, but they're thinking, we can ask for forgiveness later for some of the rules we bend in getting these confessions. Up front, we'll sort of play ignorance so that we can do what we want to do, is essentially the attitude. It's effective in the episode that the opening 10 minutes before things go down, because it's worth mentioning, none of the characters actually even witness anything to do with the rape. None that does not happen at all. They don't see anything. And one of the things that really sticks out is that the opening 10 minutes makes a point of showing all five boys being happy in different ways. We see Antron with his father, and we see them having this nice breakfast, and it's clearly a loving relationship. We see Kevin with his sister, very loving. We see all the characters in a place of happiness, which they actually replay later when they're being walked to the police cars, just to really drive home how much their life has changed in the past day or day and a half or however long it's been. And there's so many little details, because like I mentioned, the helmet thing. The helmet gets brought up. The policeman assaulting Kevin in the park gets brought up because Antron saw that. We see him kind of witness that. He's the one who's not taken in that night. He actually goes home and then is arrested in the morning once they sort of get his name from someone else. And he's like, yeah, I saw that. I saw you be hit by the policeman. So they're all aware. They're all being kind of set up here for something. And there's this kind of sad acceptance to it where this is kind of this harsh truth they've had to learn in the worst possible way. Maybe by, at their age, it's hard to say that maybe they've not necessarily came face to face with this police discrimination that obviously their parents and their older siblings have maybe experienced more firsthand. Maybe they have a sense of it. They've had some small examples, but never necessarily imagined it could get this extreme. It can never be this. It can never be potentially going to prison for this very serious and heinous crime, which none of them have any idea when happened, what happened, or anything else. It's a very infuriating watch, as it should be. It's kind of supposed to be infuriating. It's supposed to be this frustrating issue. There's this frustrating kind of experience of feeling the helplessness of the characters in the situation, because the whole point of art in many ways is to empathize, and you hope no one else ever has to go through anything like this. No one else ever has to experience this again. But the point of this is to empathize with when it did happen, so that we can hopefully stop it from happening again. That is probably naive and optimistic at this point, but it's this. Obviously, this is very topical right now. The last month or so, in the US especially, has been very topical with Black Lives Matter, with protests, with everything going on. But of course, the sad thing is that this is, it feels more relevant right now because of what's been happening in the last little while, but it's always been relevant. I think that's one of the things that sticks out, is how the black community are treated by the police, specifically in the US in this case, is what we're kind of looking at here. I feel like it's something that, certainly growing up in the UK, in a very prominently white area, I never saw any of this. I never heard about any of this. I never even knew about the idea of profiling, as it were, until I was probably in my 20s. It probably didn't even be brought to my attention until then. And a big part of that, of course, is that everyone's walking around with a camera. The big part of that is social media. A big part of that is being able to share the evidence of these things and things getting more notable media attention because of that. It's this thing where when you're growing up as a kid right now, and or not even when I was a kid, in the 90s when I would watch like sitcoms and stuff, like the idea of racism was brought up, but it was kind of brought up in a way where it was talked about as if it had been solved, right? It was talked about like, oh, that was something in the past. We've gotten over it. We're better now. It's this harsh reality of growing up and realizing that it's not solved. It's far from being solved. It's still there. It's more. We can see it a lot more now. It's and I think series like this one, movies and TV shows and any kind of media or art that kind of tackles it. Like I say, the big thing with that is really to make you empathize with something that someone has went through, because what ultimately the people profiling the racism at display is a lack of empathy, right? At its core, it's not the only thing that's going on, but it's very much a vital flaw in the way people feel and think, is a lack of caring for how someone else is feeling and seeing them as someone who does not deserve this mistreatment. And it's infuriating to watch because it feels like it could just as easily happen now. And you'd like to think that maybe the media attention, maybe people would be able to kind of argue and fight back, and we can kind of band together a little bit more over these kind of things. But you're witnessing something in this episode at a time before there was social media, before maybe there was as much. Now I know that this became kind of a talked about case. It was something that was in the media a lot at the time, and I'm sure I'll discover in the next few episodes exactly to what extent and what the conversation was. I'm fascinated to see, like, is it similar to today's kind of social media movements in some way? Is it kind of a predecessor to that? Or is it something else entirely? I'm actually really fascinated to see if it feels that different or if it just feels like the same thing in a slightly different form because it's a different time period. I'm really curious to witness that over this story. And I should know more about this. I should know more about some of these awful stories. They're not pleasant. You don't really want to hear about them, but you ultimately have to, because otherwise, how are we going to get better? We can't just pretend things don't happen. Yeah, honestly, yeah, and it's a tough subject to kind of talk about, because not because I don't feel confident in how I feel about it, but it's more just because it's a heavy topic, it's a heavy subject. There's no kind of, so many of the reviews that we do on this channel, so many of the things we talk about, they're fairly jokey conversations. We talk about serious things, we analyze, but ultimately we sit down and we'll crack jokes, we'll make fun of things that don't quite work. Even when things are good, we'll maybe crack some jokes because it's jovial, it's fun, it's lighthearted. We're here to have a friendly conversation about something. And I don't necessarily feel like joking about this. I don't feel like joking about this topic. And in fact, one of the things that kind of made me feel a little sick, because I actually reviewed some of oh god, I'm forgetting the name of it. There's many series on Netflix last year with Toni Collette about the serial rapist. Oh my god. Unbelievable? Was it Unbelievable? I think it's Unbelievable. So I didn't actually get around to finishing reviewing that. I did watch the rest of it kind of later. I was like, I kind of want to finish that, but it had been too long since I'd kind of talked about the rest to really form a proper sort of final review of it. So that was also a hard-hitting watch. Obviously, it was a very serious topic. There was very little to kind of like be jovial about or joke about. It's a very serious issue. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is because there's a moment in this episode where Felicity Hoffman kind of feels like determined to use the amount of sexual assault in the city as a way to sort of make this kind of a spearhead. It felt like it was taking a serious issue, a different serious issue, and how rampant sexual assault is, and tried to use that as an excuse to pin it on these kids. And this is the excuse for being. It's like she almost wants to show that something's being done about this one issue, and none of these things should be achieved at the expense of the other. That is, and it kind of made me feel a little bit sick when she was doing that. And her character is definitely one of the more deplorable in the shows and in this show so far. And I don't know exactly how accurate some of these characters are to the real people. It feels like something they probably took a lot of care in trying to be fairly accurate. But I don't know exactly to what extent. That's something I'll be curious to see as we go forward. It's a tough watch. It was never not going to be, but it's handled with care. It's handled with some nuance. It feels like it makes a lot of dramatic beats extremely well, and I think I appreciate that this episode is very focused. It has a very good endpoint. Like I say, them all meeting for the first time, really. We'll say 4 of them meeting for the first time, and kind of realizing what they've done to other people whilst they've been convinced to try and save themselves is kind of the emotional gut punch of the episode, and that is saying something when the episode is full of gut punching in many different ways. So yeah, obviously, I mean, this came out a while ago now, and people who are interested, for the most part, will have checked it out already. But I'm happy to be checking it out. It always looked good. It was one of those things where I think we were just too busy when it hit, and so I'm happy a patron is sending me on this path. So I mean, that's pretty much the first episode. Obviously, there's a lot of little details. It's kind of hard to separate this one in my head, because once the interrogations start, it's a lot of bouncing around the interrogations, and a lot of bouncing between kind of the scheming of the officers and how they're going to get the story the way they want it. And there's little details that are really worth pointing out. The way that the one officer doesn't care if Raymond gets to eat because he's been there for 18 hours. His father just wants to get him some food so he can eat before what he's doing next. And he's like, well, tough. There's nothing close by to go get food. So basically that's his attitude. There's little things like that throughout. And I should definitely mention that Corey, who was just waiting in like the waiting area of one of the stations, is taken by an abusive cop and assaulted, just so that the older cop can come in and pretend to be the good cop and be on his side and say, I'm on your side, and there's lots of guys out there like him, but I'm on your side. And because he's actually 16 years old, and because they need someone to kind of like make all the stories fit together, they make him do it. And again, one of the other big sort of heart-sinking moments is when he's on video and he actually says at the end, in no uncertain words, that he did commit the rape. And he kind of gets up afterwards thinking that he's off the hook now because he's done what they've asked, not realizing that this is him just sort of essentially giving up his life for the next however many years. And obviously there's more to the story in that. There's going to be more details as we go throughout, but that's kind of, and again, in an episode full of gut punches, that's another one. So no, it's, like I say, not an easy watch, but it's very well done in its writing and direction. It feels like it's constantly hitting with these little bits, and much like Unbelievable, actually, there's a lot of little moments where you're kind of analyzing how characters address the kids and how they approach the situation. Because Unbelievable was another show where a lot of it was kind of looking at the police officers who were kind of discounting the main character story and how they treated the victim in that show. Here, and which is also based on a true story, it's worth mentioning. These are both true stories, and here again, you watch this and you see kind of obviously the big in your face things of the coercion and forcing these confessions, but you're also seeing the more subtle things, the language that is used, the names that are being used for the kids, the people who are kind of there and feel powerless to help, or the parents who feel powerless to help. It feels like everything just is entangled up in a web. The second that someone has decided that they are responsible or might be responsible for something, there's almost no hope for some of these families to actually fight anything. It's a tough subject. It's a tough premise to kind of sit down here and talk about, when I can only come at it from my own experience, my own background, my own empathies, my own understanding of the situations, and ultimately I want to learn more from this. I hope more people learn from this kind of thing, and again, a lot of people already have, because this was out a while ago, but that's kind of the hope of this type of series, this type of art in general. So so no, that is part 1 of When They See Us. So so I'll be doing this over about 2 months, so you're looking at about another 2 or 3 weeks, and I'll have part 2 ready, and we'll just kind of go from there. So yeah, so hopefully my rambled thoughts have been helpful or entertaining, or at the very least informative, or maybe just adding some discussion to something that you yourself watched already and want some more opinions on. But I think it's deft with what it does. It's not necessarily subtle with a lot of things, but it doesn't need to be, nor should it be subtle. This is not the time for subtlety. This is because if the act itself, which is, and by the act I mean the act of the police force and the people who coerce these teenagers, if the act is this in your face and this blatant without remorse, then the message to oppose it kind of also should be as in your face and without remorse. So there you go. Hopefully something I said in the last 25-30 minutes made sense. But thank you for joining me. Let me know what you thought of the first part of this miniseries in the comments. Like and subscribe. Liking is really important. It helps YouTube know if we're worth recommending to other people, and more people will find our channel. So please do, if you liked what you watched here and my rambles and whatnot. You can also support us, of course, on patreon.com/MailFuzzTV for as little as $1 per month, and you get some bonuses for your trouble, but it keeps all the content coming. So thank you once again for watching or listening. I always appreciate it. Keep watching TV, guys, and I'll see you next time.